30 of 33. That's the number. Not a rumor, not a talking point from an opposition politician. According to a summary of classified U.S. intelligence assessments leaked and reported just days ago, Iran has reportedly restored operational access to 30 of the 33 missile sites it maintains along the Strait of Hormuz. The same Strait of Hormuz where American warships are operating right now. The public was told the strikes worked, that Iran's military had been shattered, that the threat was neutralized. The intelligence community, according to this reporting, told policymakers something very different. So which version is true? And what happens when President Trump lands back home from China? Published May 14th, 2026, by Fox News contributor and veteran broadcaster Hugh Hewitt, this opinion column lands at a very specific moment. President Trump is overseas in China for a high-stakes diplomatic summit. The Iran war, triggered by U.S. strikes on February 28th, according to the column, is in what the author describes as a period of relative calm. But beneath that surface calm, an intelligence gap is emerging, and it's a significant one. The column centers on a New York Times report that Hewitt encountered through a curated news newsletter. That Times report, drawing on what it described as classified U.S. assessments from early May 2026, painted a very different picture of Iran's current military posture than what administration officials have said publicly. Iran, according to those reported assessments, has not been crushed. It has been bruised, and it has already started getting back up. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, about 1/5 of the world's daily oil supply moves through that gap. And according to this reported intelligence, Iran has rebuilt enough of its missile infrastructure there to threaten both American warships and commercial oil tankers. This story is moving. Subscribe now if you want every development covered the moment it breaks, because the next move in this conflict could come with almost no warning. Let's go back to February 28th. According to Hugh Hewitt's column, that was the date the United States launched what he describes as massive strikes against Iran. The column refers to these as having rained enormous blows down on the Iranian military. What followed, Hewitt writes, was immediate and chaotic retaliation. Iran lashing out not just at Israel and U.S. military bases, but at what the column describes as a dozen other countries and their militaries and infrastructure. That's a remarkable claim, and it's worth pausing on it, not because we have independent confirmation of each element, but because the column frames it as established context for the intelligence picture that followed. Now, weeks later comes the leak, and the intelligence picture it supposedly reveals is striking in its directness. According to the New York Times report summarized in Hewitt's column, early May 2026 classified assessments showed that Iran had already regained access to most of its missile sites, launchers, and underground facilities. Not some, most. The specific breakdown cited, 30 of 33 missile sites along the Strait of Hormuz are now, to varying degrees, back in operational hands. The column quotes the Times summary of the assessment directly, noting that in some cases, Iran can use mobile launchers inside those sites to move missiles to alternate locations. In other cases, and this is the part that caught the attention of senior officials, Iran can apparently launch missiles directly from launch pads that are part of those facilities. 3 sites, the assessment reportedly says, remain totally inaccessible. 3 out of 33. Now here is where the story gets layered. Hewitt, and this is important context, is not simply accepting this intelligence assessment at face value. He explicitly references the CIA's troubled track record on Iran. He points to the 2007 National Intelligence Estimate, which declared with high confidence that Tehran had halted its nuclear weapons program back in 2003. That assessment, Hewitt argues, effectively handcuffed the Bush administration's ability to act on Iran in its final years. The conclusion he draws? Intelligence agencies have been wrong on Iran before. They could be wrong again. But here's the contradiction he lands on, and it's a pointed one. Even accounting for that uncertainty, he argues, hope is not a strategy. If there's even a reasonable chance the intelligence is accurate, If Iran has genuinely rebuilt 30 of 33 missile sites in a matter of months, then the window to act may be closing faster than anyone in the public understands. Meanwhile, President Trump is in Beijing. Diplomatic meetings, economic discussions, the kind of summit that demands full presidential focus. The Iran file, for now, sits waiting. When Air Force One touches back down on American soil, the question hanging in the air is unavoidable. What does the president do next? The official message was, the strikes worked. The intelligence assessment, according to this reporting, says something else entirely. When those two things can't both be true at the same time, something is about to give. To understand why this intelligence gap carries weight beyond the political argument Hewitt is making, you have to look at the geography. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a body of water. It is one of the most consequential maritime choke points on Earth. Roughly 17 to 21 million barrels of crude oil transit through it every single day, accounting for approximately 20% of global petroleum supply. Qatar uses it to export liquefied natural gas. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, all of them depend on that narrow corridor to move their energy exports to global markets. Now picture mobile missile launchers, repositioned, operational, aimed at that waterway. The economic consequences alone are staggering to contemplate. A disruption to traffic through the strait doesn't just hurt oil companies. It hits fuel prices at gas stations from London to Lahore. It raises shipping costs on everything from electronics to food. It triggers emergency protocols across global insurance markets. Oil futures markets have historically spiked sharply at even the suggestion of Hormuz disruption. An actual sustained threat would be a different order of magnitude. For American naval forces specifically, the threat is immediate and physical. U.S. warships operating in or near the Persian Gulf operate in an environment where short-range, mobile anti-ship missiles, the kind that can be repositioned and concealed quickly, represent one of the most persistent tactical challenges. The reported restoration of Iranian launch capability at those sites doesn't just affect diplomatic leverage. It potentially affects force protection calculations for American sailors. Do you think this situation pushes toward further military action? Or does diplomacy still have room to breathe? Let me know in the comments. This is exactly the kind of question where outside perspective matters. Now, about the CIA assessment and the credibility question it carries. The 2007 National Intelligence Estimate on Iran's nuclear program remains one of the most analyzed intelligence failures in recent American history. That document, as Hewitt recounts, declared with high confidence that Iran had stopped its nuclear weapons program in 2003. The judgment was so sweeping and so apparently definitive that it significantly constrained the Bush administration's Iran policy during its final 2 years in office. What made it worse, Israel had reportedly obtained the entire Iranian nuclear archive years later, a trove that reportedly told a very different story. But no corrected or updated estimate was publicly released. The question Hewitt raises, and it's a legitimate analytical question regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, is whether a new intelligence leak pointing to Iranian military resilience deserves the same skeptical scrutiny that the 2007 estimate deserved in reverse. The answer, if you're in Washington and responsible for policy, is that you probably can't afford to bet wrong in either direction. Here's what the column does not spend much time on, but what may matter most strategically. The leak itself. Someone with access to classified early May intelligence assessments provided the substance of that reporting to the press. In the middle of an active conflict, while the president is abroad. Intelligence leaks during active military campaigns are not random events. They come from somewhere. They serve a purpose. The question of who benefits from the public knowing that Iran has rebuilt 30 of 33 missile sites, while the administration is publicly saying the campaign worked, is a question that no one in this column addresses directly. But it's the kind of question that people inside the national security apparatus are almost certainly asking each other right now. Let's step away from the satellite images and the policy arguments for a moment And think about the people who live inside this story. Consider the sailors aboard U.S. naval vessels operating in or near the Persian Gulf right now. They were told, and their families back home were told, that the February strikes significantly degraded Iran's ability to threaten the fleet. Military families read the news. They track deployments. They calculate risk. When a classified intelligence assessment suggesting that the threat picture has changed leaks into the press, those families start doing a different kind of math. The uncertainty that creates is real. It's not abstract. Now consider the crews of commercial tankers, many of them flagged from countries with no stake in the U.S.-Iran conflict, transiting the Strait of Hormuz as a matter of routine commerce. Tanker crews are not soldiers. They're maritime workers, often from countries across South and Southeast Asia, doing a job that until recently felt like managed risk. The prospect of Iranian mobile launchers restored along the strait changes the risk calculation for every vessel that passes through. Insurance rates respond to that kind of intelligence picture. Shipping companies respond. Routing decisions get made. Some tankers may begin avoiding the strait entirely, rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks and significant costs to journeys. That cost gets absorbed somewhere, usually by consumers, usually spread across fuel prices, food transport costs, manufacturing supply chains. Then there's the Iranian domestic dimension, often the least covered part of any conflict narrative. Iran's population, overwhelmingly young, has lived for decades under a government that has repeatedly brought international military and economic pressure down on the country. International sanctions have long restricted access to medicine, technology, and basic goods for ordinary Iranians who have no say in what their government's missile forces do. Every escalation cycle deepens that pressure. Every strike, followed by retaliation, followed by a new strike, deepens the uncertainty about what life looks like 6 months from now in Tehran, in Isfahan, in Tabriz. The column Hewitt wrote does not address the Iranian civilian dimension. It's a hawkish policy argument, and it's framed as such. But in any responsible analysis of what resuming strikes means, the population caught between a regime it didn't choose and a military campaign it cannot escape is part of the moral weight of the decision. Back in the United States, there's a quieter political pressure building. Lawmakers cited in related Fox News coverage have reportedly been demanding answers about the Iran war. The question of congressional oversight, of who authorized what, and what the legal framework is for continued or resumed strikes, is not a minor procedural point. It is the architecture that determines whether this conflict has political sustainability over months or years. And then there is the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar. These governments have their own calculations. They are close enough to Iran to feel every military exchange in the form of market disruption, energy infrastructure vulnerability, and domestic political pressure. The column mentions Gulf allies as potential partners in continued action against Iran. But Gulf states have also shown historically a complicated relationship with direct U.S. military campaigns in the region, publicly supportive in some contexts, quietly hedging in others. Their private read of the intelligence picture Hewitt is citing would be worth knowing. None of these human and diplomatic pressures show up in a simple argument about whether to resume strikes, but all of them shape whether any resumed action achieves its objectives or whether it simply extends a cycle that has been running in various forms since 1979. President Trump returns from Beijing. The intelligence file is on the table. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has, according to related Fox News reporting, already said the U.S. has plans to escalate action against Iran if necessary. That phrase, if necessary, is doing enormous work right now. The column argues the bar for necessary has already been crossed. 30 operational missile sites along the Strait of Hormuz is Hewitt's answer to that question. But here's what no one can answer cleanly. If the February strikes did not prevent Iran from restoring most of its missile infrastructure within months, what does the next wave of strikes accomplish differently? And what does Iran's next retaliation look like, given that the last one reportedly spread to a dozen countries simultaneously? The clock on that answer is running. Step back far enough, and what you're looking at is a recurring problem that has defined American Iran policy for nearly half a century. The Islamic Republic, founded in 1979, has operated on a strategic logic that has proved remarkably durable. Survive pressure, absorb punishment, reconstitute capability, re-emerge. It happened after the Iran-Iraq War, which devastated the country through the 1980s. It happened after wave of international sanctions. It happened after the assassination of senior military commanders. The pattern, disruption followed by reconstitution, is not accidental. It is baked into how the regime structures its military architecture, with underground facilities, mobile systems, and dispersed command structures specifically designed to survive and recover from conventional strikes. The 2007 intelligence failure Hewitt references is part of this longer story. The United States intelligence community has repeatedly struggled to accurately characterize Iran's nuclear and military programs, sometimes underestimating, sometimes overestimating, occasionally getting the trend right, but the timeline wrong. The CIA's checkered record on Iran, as Hewitt describes it, is a genuine institutional problem that should inform how any new assessment is consumed and weighted. What the column argues, stripped to its core, is that this particular intelligence estimate, even if imperfect, demands a response. That the alternative to action is a situation where Iran uses the pause to fully reconstitute. That the window to prevent Iran from maintaining a sustained missile threat along the Strait of Hormuz is time-sensitive. And that negotiations with the current Iranian leadership have no realistic path to resolution. Whether you agree with that argument or not, the strategic question underneath it is real and contested. There is a serious counter-argument, one the column doesn't engage, that sustained military pressure without a defined political end state simply produces recurring cycles of destruction and reconstitution, with no durable outcome and increasing costs on all sides. That argument points to the need for a negotiated framework, however difficult and imperfect. The JCPOA, which Hewitt dismisses, had genuine verification mechanisms that did constrain Iranian enrichment for the years it was in force, whatever its other flaws. The harder problem is that both arguments are partially right. Military pressure without political strategy leads nowhere stable. But political strategy without credible pressure, given the current Iranian leadership's demonstrated behavior, has also repeatedly produced outcomes the West did not intend. Where does that leave us? With a president returning from China carrying an intelligence briefing that reportedly contradicts his own administration's public narrative. With a defense secretary who has already signaled that escalation options remain on the table. With a Strait of Hormuz that 20% of the world's daily oil supply still has to pass through. And with a conflict that, according to this analysis, is not in its resolution phase. It's in its pause phase. What Iran does with that pause, what the United States does with it, whether the intelligence assessment is right or catastrophically wrong in the way the 2007 estimate was wrong. Those are the questions that will determine whether this conflict narrows towards some kind of endpoint or opens into something much larger. The column has a clear answer. The intelligence community's answer, apparently, is classified. And the administration's public answer, according to this reporting, doesn't match what it's telling policymakers in private. That gap is the story, and it isn't closed. This conflict is at an inflection point that most daily news coverage isn't fully connecting. The February strikes, the intelligence picture, the Beijing summit, the Strait of Hormuz, these aren't separate threads. They're the same story. And the next chapter could come fast. What do you think actually happens when Trump returns? Does the administration resume strikes? Is there still a diplomatic lane? Drop your read on this in the comments. I want to know what you think the next move is. And subscribe, because when this story breaks further, you're going to want to be here for it.